Hi there, Lindsay here, and I got a comment yesterday or possibly the day before on my homeschool curriculum video for 2017-2018, and it was a really thought-provoking comment, and I really wanted to discuss that more so than just type out an answer because I feel like I can better express myself through spoken word than through written word. So this is kind of a little bit of a touchy subject, I think, when it comes to being a Christian and choosing what to put in your child's curriculum. And so if you've got your kids around, I might caution you against actually listening to this with them there, because I'm going to discuss a few things like myths and legends and fairy tales and one particular rather rotund man in a red suit that comes around December 25th. So if you don't want their current perspectives to be shattered, try not to have them here whenever you're watching this video. So the comment was in regards to using Grimm's fairy tales and using The Sorcerer's Apprentice from Ducasse and watching Fantasia from Disney. And the caution, I appreciate the person's perspective, what little of their perspective they shared with me, because I understand the level of concern. And we are allowing things like fairy tales and Sorcerer's Apprentice by Ducasse and Fantasia into our home because we are intentionally trying to show our children a biblical worldview, and I find that by exposing them to things that that have to do with fairy tales and with the imagination and with things like sorcery and even one of the words that the commenter used was demonic images, or maybe they didn't use images, but they definitely used the word demonic. And the thing that my husband and I, have discovered is that our children are extremely well adept at discerning what is myth, fairy tale, make-believe, not real, versus what is real. And the thing of fairy tales is that they get to be exposed to good and evil in such a fanciful way that they can determine which is which without being explicitly told. And they are able, it presents them the opportunity to see good and evil in a way that is not their reality. And the Grimm's tales, or fairy tales, the collection of their fairy tales, which are very, very gruesome. And French fairy tales are very gruesome. Just most fairy tales are gruesome, and they are not the watered down versions that Disney would have us, believe they are. So the girls, they have a very pragmatic way of looking at life. They're very realistic, and yet they still enjoy playing make-believe. They still enjoy pretending they're mermaids or fairies or what have you, without genuinely believing that they might become magical or become something other than what they are. And I guess ultimately we're allowing things like that because I want them to be exposed to those things where I have a lot more control over how they're presented and how we can discuss things such as in Fantasia, I can't remember if there are 7 or 8 movements, but in the second to the last, it's a very dark and very evil sounding piece that they use. And the imagery in Fantasia is quite, I would agree that it is somewhat demonic. And it is, in Fantasia, they're presenting multiple creationist theories. They've got some Greek mythology in there. They've got pantheism in there. They've got, what else did they have in there? Just various like fanciful things. We know that hippos don't really wear tutus and ballet shoes. And we know that animals on, say, cartoons, they don't really talk. And we know that there's there's a difference between reality and these fanciful, imaginative ideas and art and creativity that people have put together versus truth and God's creativity. And but then also, like, immediately following the movement that is very dark and borderline demonic, there is the final movement where they're going through playing Ave Maria, and that has, it's full of light, and you see the very extreme dichotomy between dark and light. And it gives you that deep, resounding feeling of good and evil. And it's something that they are able to pick up on. And if I never show them anything that is dark or is portraying evil, then they will be shocked when they get out into the world. And I would rather be able to present those things in such an extraordinary way, such as with the fairy tales, and prove to them that magic is a man-made idea, whereas God's miracles and the Bible are truth. And what God did through his miracles, that is real. But it's always God doing it. It is not man doing it. It is not some superhero story where you get bit by a radioactive spider and you get to all of a sudden shoot webs out of your wrists. It is not being Superman and flying around the world and in leaps and bounds and having super strength. It is not those things. And we're currently using a neoclassical method for educating our girls, and we're also starting to pull in some of Charlotte Mason's methods and her ideology about how children are whole persons. And Charlotte Mason discusses faith and God and Christ as the center foundation of everything in her teachings. And she still had her students reading fairy tales, Plutarch, then also things like Beowulf. She had them reading these things because they were good pieces of literature where you could actually make a decision for yourself what is good and evil. And the thing about fairy tales is that I believe our children can learn that sometimes evil is disguised and it is dressed up as something that is not evil. And then good can also be disguised and dressed up as something that is not blatantly obvious that it is good. And my children have they've enjoyed reading through the fairy tales, and they discern what the moral is in those stories without me having to explicitly tell them. And they can explain to me, I really didn't like this particular character because of these things. Like, he was acting mean, or this person was acting ugly, and it wasn't right for this hero character to go in and cut someone's head off because they didn't like the answer they got, and they have this real grasp of good versus evil, and they can discern those things even in a fanciful world of fairy tales. So by exposing them to these things in our home, we have a much greater ability to guide them through a biblical viewpoint and ask them the questions. How does that stand up to Scripture? How does that stand up to what God says? How is that in line, and how is that different? Let's just talk about these things. And that is ultimately what I want. I want them to be able to discuss those things with us in our home, where we can help to mold and guide their way of thinking that is biblical, instead of sheltering them from those things until they turn 18 and get out into the world to college, where, the entire gamut of humanism and pantheism and Taoism and Buddhism and Islam and just all of those various things that are out there start to make their impression. If we don't introduce those things in our home and explain to them, here's what God says and here's what the world says, then they're going to have a much more difficult time discerning what biblical truth is and what capital T truth is. So I really appreciate you listening to this, and I guess I never really got to the Santa Claus thing. Let's touch on that for just a couple of moments. This to me demonstrated that Caitlin has a complete, firm grasp on reality and truth instead of believing that fairy tales are real. Over a year ago, she came to me and she asked me, "Mom, is Santa real?" And I asked her, "Well, what do you mean? Why do you ask me this question?" Common parenting deflection. And she said, "Well, I just don't think that one person can get around the whole world in one night. Is that real? Is that really possible? I mean, it takes us forever to fly anywhere." And it was at that moment that I understood she's a pragmatic child. She is a realist to her core. And I decided, I have two routes here. I could choose to explain to her that, well, Santa Claus won't bring you any presents if you don't believe he's real. Or I could choose to explain to her that Santa Claus is a legend that was born out of born from this one man who lived back in the 500s, and his name was St. Nicholas. And I explained to her that that was a real man, and he did real benevolent things, and he did give to the poor, and he really did give gifts. But the legend grew and changed and shifted to what we now view as Santa Claus. And she understood that. It was, we were able to go through and read about St. Nicholas and understand the differences between that man versus what the current depiction of Santa Claus is. So I knew at that point that by exposing her to the fairy tales, the myths, the legends, things like Beowulf or Homer's Iliad, I don't think we're going to find any sirens anytime soon here at any of our lakes. Or those are not rooted in real. But she can understand that there is real danger, and she can see that depicted through these morals or through these myths and legends and fairy tales. So we have decided to allow those things in our home as a way for us to help guide them to seeing biblical truth. So I really appreciate the commenter leaving that for me. And it really did make my brain kind of get all amped up, and I felt like I was on a roller coaster for a little bit because I knew my reasons for allowing those things into our homeschool, but I didn't know of a way to graciously say them. And I pray that I have been giving grace here. I do think that it is a prayerful consideration as to what you allow into your homeschool. And if you choose to not present Grimm's fairy tales or choose not to allow things that depict somewhat demonic images, then I completely respect that. That is 100% something that you have to pray about and discern for your children and in your home. And after some very careful thought and consideration and prayer, we do believe that by allowing them to see certain things while we can help guide their thoughts and guide their reasoning skills into a biblical worldview, that we are doing what is right by our children. So I thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to y'all next time. Bye.